Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. The making of the American mind. That is a crucial conversation to be had, not just by people who live in the United States of America, but genuinely from across the world, because there's something truly unique about the American epistemological framework, how the citizens of the United States ought to think about things like constitution, liberty, rights, responsibilities, separation of powers, and the role of government. Joining me to have a conversation about this is the author of this amazing book, The Making of the American Mind, The Story of Our Declaration of Independence, by Matthew Spalding. Matthew, I want to say thank you very much for penning this book, and also, how are you?
I'm fine. Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, very happy to be speaking with you. For those of you listening, Matthew is the Kirby Professor in Constitutional Government and Dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale College. So, Matthew, I want to begin by asking you to talk very briefly about the notion of our declaration and the kind of the intellectual framework behind the organizing of the clauses in the Declaration.
It's I've been teaching this for some decades. I had a wonderful set of teachers when I did my PhD out in Claremont, and I had some good history teachers as well. So I've been thinking about this and working on this from my teachers to me, and then me to my own students for some time. And obviously, this is the 250th anniversary. I wanted to go back and look at it in more depth. But as a result, what I've developed over the years, and then spending a good year writing and a year preparing to think about this, what I wanted to do was we always know the famous phrases of the Declaration. We know a few things here and there, but I wanted to essentially allow it to tell its own narrative. So I wanted to tell it the story of how it was created, how it was written, how it was amended, how it was worked and come into being. But then what I really wanted to do was to go through the document very carefully, essentially line by line, and talk about what particular words mean. And as a result, you get a very different sense of it as a document. It's a political document written by a Congress, a Continental Congress, but it becomes much more like a symphony. There are different movements. There are fast parts, slow parts. There are builds up to great moments. It reprises certain themes, but you need to look at it and study as a whole document, because it was written as a whole document, and it lays out and tells a story. It's a legal document, so it has, if you imagine a courtroom or a court case, here's what we're going to do, here's our claim, here are the principles that are going to guide us in thinking this through. Here's the process by which we came to our decision. Here are the grievances or the evidence, the facts of the case, and here is our conclusion. So it really kind of comes together as this beautifully written document, rhetorical, appropriate for the moment, but also a very powerful argument. Written very carefully by this Continental Congress at this moment of great, literally on the edge of going to war. It's an amazing document.
And there are a few things that you highlighted even in your response, which I think is so profound. The chief among which is you speak of the Declaration as not only the result of a story, but also telling the story, which we can dive into in a little bit. One aspect that comes out in your book is that by virtue of the words, the demands, the phrases that are put into the Declaration, there's an implicit request, dare I say even a demand, of virtuous patriotism that it presupposes. Can you please help us understand how the framers thought about this patriotism as a requisite virtue for dwelling in this republic?
That's well said and well asked. I think part of it is, and the book does this in various ways, actually several times in just different openings of different chapters, I'm constantly reminded of how the first thing we need to do is kind of put us in their world, so to speak, which is not to say it's a different world. I think it's actually a world grounded in a philosophical reality that really partakes in the whole Western tradition, for that matter. But it's not our modern world, let's put it that way. And so part of it is we have to kind of recenter ourselves philosophically, culturally, morally, politically, to understand what is going on in this declaration. And there are various ways in which this comes up, and I'm sure we'll come back to them in our conversation. But the particular one you raised here, this question of patriotism, broadly speaking, and the need for a certain type of citizenry. We today we have this kind of jaundiced view of all that. Well, that's kind of chauvinistic and jingoistic. Patriot has a bad name. But for the founders, you have to remember what is the radical thing they're doing here, and radical meaning going the rootedness of it is that they're making this claim to break away, and now they're this further standard for which they're going to now build a nation is based on this idea that we can govern ourselves, self-government. Well, in order to govern ourselves politically, it presupposes that we can govern ourselves as individuals. We can govern the self. It assumes a certain type of person that is capable of self-government. That's not a problem if you've got a king or a despot or a tyrant, and you're merely a subject. But if you're a citizen, you're a self-governing citizen, you've actually got to uphold, understand your rights and responsibilities. And this comes up throughout the Declaration. And it really that was the world in which they were operating, which I actually suggest is not a newfangled modern idea, but actually the founders going back to a much older idea, which really partakes in the whole the medieval and really going back to the Roman sense of the republic, if not going back to the Greek sense of that man being able to understand and rule himself. But it does completely presupposes a certain type of individual, which I think is not something we can't demand or know today. There are many good, solid self-governing individuals in America, but our society, our culture, our modern sense of these things has completely masked it in a way that we don't see anymore, and we need to recover that. So it's a noble thing to be self-governing, which is at the center of the Declaration.
Now, into that conversation, we're running out of time in this segment, but I'm thoroughly enjoying this. Into that conversation, especially in the earlier part of the book, you introduce the Jeffersonian paradigm and how his influence brought about that healthy tension between the role of government in a somewhat ubiquitous manner, but also its great limitation for the sake of the exercise of liberty. Can you begin? Just touch on that very briefly, and then once the music hits, we'll pick up on the other side of the break.
Yeah, well, a bigger question to be talked about at more. But you're right. But again, it goes back to this sense of this where they're coming from. Today we find this is kind of strikingly different, but it's exactly, if you had been shaped by the Western tradition, of course, where you would end up, which is it's a rejection of tyranny, based on this notion that we have inherent liberty, our natural liberty, as the medieval tradition, growing out of the Christian tradition, the Greeks and the Romans argued for. This is natural liberty. So it's always this tension between you need government, we need government so we can rule together as a community. We need laws and rules of justice and defend ourselves and our nation. But all of that should serve the purpose of allowing us to govern ourselves, which is the more noble activity of politics. Think of Aristotle. But also is the end of the American sense of our politics, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that tension is worked out then throughout the Declaration.
My guest is Dr. Matthew Spalding, Kirby Professor in Constitutional Government, Dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale College. He's penned this amazing book. I remember receiving it and just being unable to put it down. It's called The Making of the American Mind, the story of our Declaration of Independence. Continuing on the other side, I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Pete. I'm talking with Dr. Matthew Spalding, professor and dean at Hillsdale College and the author of The Making of the American Mind, the story of our Declaration of Independence. Matthew, you had just begun touching on very briefly the concept of Jefferson's thought of limited government in relation to individual liberty. I'd like to ask you to revisit that in a more expansive manner because we were curtailed by time. But before we do that, this concept of the American mind, I understand it's very broad, but what does it mean to say, what does it mean to have an expression of the American mind? What does that create as a difference in terms of, say, the British mind or the Canadian mind?
Right. Again, a great question. Let me pick up at the end of your statement there first. One of the things I noticed in thinking all this through is in the Declaration, it always refers to the Americans as a people. Mm-hmm. This is true for all the other Continental Congress documents as well. The Americans are always a people. On the beginning of the Declaration, it's just one people. The British, on the other hand, are always referred to, as in the Declaration, as our British brethren. Mm-hmm. We're literally related to them, right? But they aren't a people in the same way the Americans are a people, because they don't think of themselves as a people. They are subjects to the king. They aren't self-governing in the way that the Americans are trying to set up a government, which means they don't think as a citizenry and as a body politic. So there isn't a British mind in the way that the Americans are thinking of the term. The particular term, the expression of American mind, comes from a great letter that Jefferson writes to Henry Lee later in 1826, as we're approaching the first great anniversary of the Declaration, right before Jefferson dies. It's one of his last letters, and he's asked about the Declaration. He says, "Look, I didn't intend to invent a bunch of new ideas here or put new things into this document," which is a great admission, a correct admission, I think, on the part of Jefferson. This wasn't merely him making things up. This is Jefferson's mind. What he was trying to capture, he says very clearly, are the sentiments that were already out there, meaning they had been brewing around in the Continental Congress and pamphlets for the last couple of years. Because remember, this is an experiment in self-government. They're arguing, they're debating, they're talking, they're communicating, they're writing. All the great pamphlets, all the things during the Revolution, that's the American mind he's trying to capture, right? It's a self-governing mind, and they're working their way through as citizens, as thinkers, as statesmen. What are the grounds upon which we should proceed? Ideas of equality, consent, natural right, natural law, all of those things are coming together, and they're talking with each other such that they come together and they culminate in this Continental Congress. And Jefferson does his best, brilliantly, by the way. He's an extremely gifted writer. Mm-hmm. It's heavily edited in crucial ways, but it's Jeffersonian language he uses, but he intentionally, admittedly, uses it to capture the American mind, which is the mind found in all those arguments of this self-governing people. So there is an American mind. There was then, I think there actually is still today, in the sense that we are a people that govern together. We have certain principles we're oriented towards. There are certain debates we have. There is a corporate mind. It's harder to capture today. It's broken up. It's divided. It's debated. But the concept that a nation could have a mind of its own makes sense, especially in the American context, if you think of a people dedicated to a certain set of principles. The basics, the fundamentals about rights and consent and the rule of law and eventually a constitution. We debate about everything else. We disagree about everything else, but we agree on the fundamentals. It's the agreement on the fundamentals that makes up the American mind.
That's beautiful, and that raises, therefore, a few aspects that I'd like you to speak into. Number one, this concept of the heritage that we receive from the English, which you do due diligence in highlighting, which I'm very grateful for, but at the same time, nature's law, and the Judeo-Christian heritage.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is, well, for a couple of reasons. One is there's always been this long debate about these traditions and their influence and whatnot. And I wanted to capture all of them and give them their due because they're extremely important. I mean, look, the Americans, before they understood themselves as Americans, which actually develops pretty quickly, and they understand themselves as a people. But they're British. They're clearly British. They understand themselves as having inherited British history. That's their history. Mm-hmm. So the English history is extremely important. And we have to recognize the extent to which, even though there are other traditions, we think of the Christian tradition or the classical tradition, all of those traditions come through the British, through the common law, which is heavily influenced by Christianity, but also heavily influenced by Cicero. So it's really how all these things came to shape America, to form that American mind, that is crucially important. And I identified, first of all, the classical tradition. Many ways the fundamental ideas of the West are Greek and Roman. But the Romans, especially Cicero, are extremely influential when it comes to the American founders. They all study Cicero in school. The idea of reviving a republic. The British tradition, of course, is extremely important. That's their history. The common law, the whole legal system is inherited from the British. And they're very conscious of the wars in England, which gives rise to their sense of religious liberty being very important, among other things. And then, of course, the whole Christian tradition itself. We have this debate today, always at a Christian nation, and we're kind of getting these particulars, and sometimes I think we're missing the forest for the trees, which is to say that their whole horizon was the horizon of the Christian tradition. And they're deeply shaped by that. It's overwhelmingly Protestant, but there's a Catholic minority, which is very important. But there's also a Jewish minority that turns out to be very important. But their Protestantism of the time of the founding is still heavily influenced by what today we might associate with more Catholic thinkers. At the time of the founding, there was still a very strong natural law tradition, which came out of the medievals. Richard Hooker, the great Anglican thinker, writes a whole treatise on law, which is very influential. It's heavily based on Aquinas and Aristotle. So all this is in the air. It's the water. It's everywhere. And it's the mixture of all those things that is kind of the petri dish in which the American mind then develops into this new nation. And I think that we need to be careful. Sometimes we think of the American founding, the Declaration in particular, as, it's a bunch of ideas that John Locke had. Thomas Jefferson read John Locke, then Jefferson wrote it, as if that's all there is to it. And we just know that that's not how these things work. It's not how history develops. It's not how great documents like the Declaration get written. Yeah. It's not how politics operates. So that's, again, going back to, I wanted to tell the complete story. And I think you study them, their debates, what went on in the Continental Congress, Adams and Jefferson and all the pamphlets and writings, you see a much different and a much richer story, in my opinion. So I wanted to let the Declaration tell its own story. And it comes out in its words, what it says.
I'm one of those people who has a great appreciation for in this case, a kind of eclectic sourcing of the different influences. And so I'm tremendously grateful for the work you did, the due diligence, the very, for want of a better expression, balanced approach. I'm talking with Dr. Matthew Spalding. He is a professor and dean at Hillsdale College and the author of this amazing book, The Making of the American Mind, the story of our Declaration of Independence. In it, Matthew goes through essentially each key clause in the Declaration. And he goes through the historical context, the philosophical context, and in the continuation of this conversation on the other side of the break, also the reason and revelation interplay that our framers clearly had in mind in putting together the framework and the foundation of this amazing republic that we ought to be grateful for. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with Dr. Matthew Spalding, author of The Making of the American Mind, The Story of Our Declaration of Independence, published by Encounter Press. I greatly encourage every single person listening, please procure a copy of this. Read it at least once in your lifetime, but honestly, just take your time with it and understand the history, the currents, the ebbs and flows of human existence and events that led to all the blessings that we have in this wondrous republic we call the United States of America. So, Matthew, to pick up where we had left off, you had just begun talking about the numerous influences that led to the language in the Declaration. You had touched on Locke, so let's pick up from there. How much of an influence did Locke really have? We know substantial, but we can also couch that within the grander framework of the other influences as well.
No, that's exactly right. The Locke is extremely important. Locke, and I would actually add also Algernon Sidney, who's writing about the same time in very similar vein, but kind of that kind of radical Whig writing coming out of the Glorious Revolution. Locke is well known in the colonies. He was kind of becoming déclassé in England at this point. But he's well known in the colonies, but I think he's been overly emphasized. The Lockean influence really kind of grows out of the progressives were the first that overemphasized Locke, and I think we need to have a more balanced view. And what I found most striking about the Locke question, because if we think of Locke merely strictly from a political philosophy point of view, Locke has a number of different writings, political writings, and his other writings, more philosophical writings, actually are much more modern and problematic in terms of how he thinks knowledge and sensory perceptions and these kinds of things. So what do you do with Locke? What I found most influential, because I had my one of my great teachers would emphasize Locke, but then point out that Locke's kind of problematic, but it's the wrong question when it comes to America. The question for America is, what do they make of Locke? What do they use Locke for? How do they take it? How do they make use of certain parts of Locke and not other parts of Locke? So it's not a question of what does Locke think per se. It's what do the Americans think of Locke. And there, it's clear they knew the political Locke, the two treatises. They picked up his arguments about consent and equality and natural right, natural law. But they didn't pick up a lot of the other philosophical problematic Locke. They weren't interested in that question at the time. They read Locke within the Christian tradition. And what especially was striking in my case in terms of thinking all this through and studying it is that the majority of the references to Locke come up and are found in the writings of the founding fathers of that era, and they come up in sermons. And that was striking to me. They read Locke through the Locke who wrote about religious toleration, who wrote about the reasonableness of Christianity, and who wrote about politics, which say that about equality and consent. Those are the things they were interested on. That's the Locke they quote. That's the Locke they knew. So in that sense, Locke was influential. But we shouldn't allow that to allow us to miss the larger picture here, which is that they saw Locke within the larger tradition, which influenced them overall, which is still this classical and Christian tradition. That's how they read Locke. And that's very clear once you actually see what they said, what they wrote about, what's in their pamphlets, and what isn't in their pamphlets, for that matter. They weren't, as I like to say, the American founders weren't political philosophers. Mm-hmm. This is not a seminar on political philosophy per se. Mm-hmm. They were statesmen. They were political thinkers of a high magnitude, but they were thinking about practical questions. And that's the Locke they turned to. But they also turned to Christian writings more generally. I mentioned Hooker, which is Hooker's Locke is quotes Hooker a lot. Their own writings, other historical writings, British history, common law, Blackstone, Edmund Cook. So in that context, I think Locke is seen very differently than the sense that, oh, they're merely a bunch of Lockeans. Locke is problematic, therefore America is problematic because it's all just Lockean. I think it kind of misses the whole picture and is unfair to the founders and just historically not accurate.
Now, let's be fair to them a little more then, to also touch on, like you mentioned, this very powerful Lockean, Blackstonian influence, Sidney's influence, but let's also touch on the interplay between how our founders thought about reason and revelation, the question of the intellectual bearing upon the truths of divine revelation, and how that applies to, like you mentioned, they're not trying to be political philosophers or even political theologians, but they had a shared political philosophy and theology that was applied into the concept of the Republic.
No, absolutely, and good that you bring that up. Today we moderns assume that reason and revelation are at odds. They're at war with each other, and we study these things and all these ideas as if it's a war, who wins. And supposedly one side is on the side of reason and the other is the side of revelation. What is just so striking about the American founders generally, and the Declaration in particular, is it appeals to both, as in at the opening of the Declaration, the laws of nature, natural law, the rational tradition, and the laws of nature's God, which I understand, given its where the language comes from and its understanding is kind of a sense of a general revelation. That's not direct revelation, but the revelation that we understand man's participation in the eternal things, as Aquinas might say. So it's both of those things are throughout the Declaration, and it touches on both of them, but assumes they agree not on everything, but on certain fundamentals. And on certain fundamentals, reason and revelation are on the same side. Mm-hmm. About humanity, about man being created equal, about them being endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and about those rights being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And thus, just government, should be based on consent. You can understand that as a rational argument from the tradition of reason, Aristotle, Cicero, up through including modern Enlightenment thinkers, so as a reason argument. But it's also perfectly compatible with, as they knew, and as you see in writings of the Christian tradition, it's very compatible with a sense of revelation. It's not a complete revelation; it's not the fullness of all revelation, but it's consistent with what we might call the preambles, or if you will, the beginnings of faith. And so it's kind of a sweet spot, if you want to put it in those practical terms. That's the sweet spot upon which the founding is grounded. So those that are more inclined to think politics should be based on the rational tradition going back to the pagans, it's there. Those who think there's more of a theology to all of this, where I put myself, it's not necessarily the New Testament. It's not the particulars of a doctrinal religion at all, but there's a substantive theology there. You can see that as well. And the beauty of it is that Jefferson, even though Jefferson himself is actually rather quirky when it comes to questions of religion, including Christianity, he knew who he was writing for. He knew his audience. The Continental Congress made some amendments to strengthen theology of the Declaration. So they knew what they were doing. And there's clearly intended to be a substance there that appeals to both the rational tradition, not in the modern sense, but in the deeper and longer, older sense of the rational tradition. But also there's clearly several references to and appeals to and a compatibility with, at its most basic, the theological tradition that's perfectly compatible with the Christian tradition, including and the Hebraic tradition. And the Declaration beautifully pulls all that together. And so it really becomes, at that point, it becomes really poetic in terms of how it talks about the grounding of these things in a way that I was especially drawn to and have become drawn to more and more over the years. If you think of it in the sense of the way, say, a C.S. Lewis deals with natural law, it's something that kind of draws you in in a rational way. This is what we understand with our minds, but then it naturally points to things that transcend ourselves. Indeed, sometimes actually even points us towards the eternal. And the Declaration, I think, does that. If we read it honestly and clearly, without kind of modern blinders on it, it's there. And that's what I'm trying to encourage my readers to do, especially in this great anniversary year.
Yeah, and you certainly have, and you and I, we're in lockstep in viewing every one of these areas. I'm very grateful for your book, and I was serious when I said I couldn't put it down as soon as I picked it up. So, Matthew, once again,
that's actually good, because part of it was I think it actually it's a great story. It's an exciting story, especially if you think of how it was being done. So,
well, thank you once again very much for making the time. You've been very generous with your time and with the penning of this book. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
My guest has been Dr. Matthew Spalding. He's a professor and a dean at Hillsdale College, author of this amazing book, The Making of the American Mind, the story of our Declaration of Independence. It's a beautifully written book because it tells the story, the framework, the grounding, the background that went into what we now know as the Declaration of Independence. We owe it to the great heritage that we have and all of the blessings that we enjoy in this wondrous republic to be students of our Constitution, of our history, and of our founding documents. And so procure a copy of this book, The Making of the American Mind by Matthew Spalding. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.